Okay, this class is going to look at key ecological terms. For example, one ecological term is biome. And what are biomes? Well, biomes are shown on maps. For example, each of these different colors represents a certain biome. So the thing in light green here is a tropical rainforest. That's a biome. This brown region is a savanna. The red regions are deserts, and so on. So a biome is a ecological, so it's a area with a characteristic type of plant and animal life, which can be shown on a map. We'll discuss it in more detail in a minute. So the objective for this class is differentiate between key ecological terms and concepts. So the terms we're going to look at are species, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, habitat, niche, biome, and ecotone. So again, this just writes the same thing down. So species then. Then what is a species? A species is a group of organisms that share a genetic heritage. In other words, they all come from a similar common ancestor. And the key thing after that is they're able to interbreed and create offspring that are also fertile. Related species might have a common ancestor, but they might even produce offspring, but the offspring are infertile, such as a horse and a donkey which produce a mule. So they are different species, although they look fairly similar. We know they're different species because the offspring can't reproduce. Different species are separated from each other by reproductive barriers. Again, that's fairly straightforward. The reproductive barriers means that either they can't produce offspring at all, or if they can, they are infertile. These barriers can be geographical. There's a mountain range separating two populations. It can also be a water body. Remember, India used to be part of the African continent, but separated from it. And therefore, the elephants on the Asian landmass eventually became a separate species from the African elephant. So it can be a geographical, such as a mountain range, or as I said, a water body. You can think of one lake separating into two, and from that you have different. The fish become separated from each other and become different species, or genetic barriers that do not allow for reproduction. Again, the horse and the donkey, it's a genetic barrier. So scientists have changed their definition of species several times throughout history. The problem is that defining species is fairly difficult, and the best way is up here, able to interbreed and create a fertile offspring. It's not ideal, but it's the best. It's not ideal, for example, because we can't be certain if animals which are separated from each other can interbreed or not. I can say more about that in a bit. So, species is one of the most specific classification systems that scientists use to describe animals and plants for that matter. So scientists use a system of binomial nomenclature. Binomial means two names to describe animals without the confusion of common names. The point about common names is people might use different common names in different places. And sometimes the name used in one area for a certain animal might be used in a different place for a different animal or plant. The systems that use genus as a first name, which is always capitalized, and the species name is a second name, which is always lowercase. That's important, that the genus is capitalized and the species is common. Thus, the red fox is vulpes. The first one is with a capital V, and the second one is with a common V. So both in the genus vulpes, and notice pronunciation is vulpes, not vulps. And the common name is vulpes. And going on from that, since the day of Carl Linnaeus, the creator of binomial nomenclature, animals have been constantly classified and reclassified into groups, genus, species, and subspecies. So we can also refer to a subspecies, although some people query the efficacy of this. Linnaeus, classifying organisms in the 1700s, restricted his classification to physical attributes of organisms. So Linnaeus only looked at physical attributes. Most organisms, surprisingly, he correctly identified as being related. So quite often, organisms which look similar are related. But this isn't always the case. You have what is called convergent evolution, where organisms which are not genetically related can look very close to each other. And this is called convergent evolution. For example, some marsupials look very close to placental mammals. So there's an Australian wolf, or a Tasmanian wolf, sorry, which looks very similar to a dog, although they're not related at all. So others he couldn't have been more wrong about. So he sometimes made some bad errors because, as I said, some things might look similar when they are not. Modern day genetic techniques have given us a much better window for historical relationships between animals, because related animals will always have similar DNA. But similar DNA can't be produced by convergent evolution. For instance, when Linnaeus first classified the elephant in the early 1700s, he only ever knew one specimen. This was a fetal Asian elephant, the smallest known elephants today. And not knowing any better, Linnaeus named the species Elephas maximus. And of course, that's not a good name because the African elephant is much larger. So modern day scientists have been forced to reclassify the elephant several times. In fact, it was even done more recently than when this thing was written. So, for example, for the African elephant, we now know it belongs to two distinct species. We have the savanna elephant, which lives in the grasslands in Africa, and the forest elephant, which lives in the African forests. Sadly, African forests are being fragmented, and therefore the uh, forest elephant is a seriously threatened species. So the first distinction is between the Asian and African elephants, which are much different in size. African elephants much bigger. Scientists then had to further distinguish between elephants that inhabited grasslands and those that lived in the forest of Africa. These are now known to be different species. Genetics have shown that populations do not interbreed and are separated by a reproductive barrier. Okay, so in fact, sorry, this presentation did mention that. Oftentimes, the barrier to reproduction is geographic or based on physical location of aliments. If this changes, the animal can interbreed and may merge into one species. This is currently being seen in the wild in polar bears and grizzly bears. Polar bears and grizzly bears uh, live in different habitats, uh, and now they're beginning to interbreed. And the problem is that polar bears are adapted to living in the snow, and the grizzly bear is adapted to living in forests. And the hybrid is not suitable for either. Um, so as climate changes, polar bears are being forced to further south and must start exploring different food sources. The changing climate also allows grizzly bears to venture further north, encountering polar bears along the way. And the previously separated populations now have a chance to breed, and sometimes they are successful. And hybrids have been seen in the wild, but it is not yet known if hybrids will be successful. The problem with the hybrids is they're not well adapted either for the snow or the forest. And there are many different situations and examples of reproductive barriers. Um, so in the case of the bears, it's an ecological barrier rather than a geographic one, because they can come into contact with each other, but they inhabit different ecological conditions. But but if the barrier is removed, it is likely the two related species will be able to interbreed. Non-related species rarely have the possibility of breeding because they have become too different from each other. For instance, a bat and a turtle have completely different genetic makeups, and the genes that control growth in a turtle will not function in a bat and vice versa. So even, for example, a dog and a cat are two genetically different. So it's not possible for them to interbreed. So we first of all looked at species. We're now going to look at population. And the population is a number of organisms of the same species that live in a particular geographical area at the same time, with the capacity, capability of interbreeding. So that's what a population is. For interbreeding to occur, individuals must be able to mate with other members of a population and produce fertile offspring. However, populations contain genetic variation within themselves, and not all individuals are equally able to survive and reproduce. Um, Populations can occur on various scales. A population can be confined to a spatially small area, example, the fish in one pond. However, this locality can operate on a regional, countrywide, island or continental scale. It may even make up an entire species. So we can change what a meaning of a population depending on context. It can make it very regional, or it can be more general. If individuals of a local population are able to disperse between other local populations, this is called a metapopulation. Uh, so a metapopulation will refer to the um, combination of local populations. Um, so after population, we have community. And the biotic community is also known as the biota. Biosynosis is a group of organisms that live together and interact with each other within an environment or habitat. And together with the biotic community and physical landscape or biotic factors, they make up an ecosystem. So an ecosystem looks at a community together with the abiotic factors that are present. And of course, biotic means living, and abiotic is non-living. And communities consist of different species which partake in direct and indirect biotic interactions. So all members of a community interact with each other in different ways, such as a predator-prey interaction. We have a predator interacting with prey. You have herbivory, where we have herbivores eating plants. Parasitism, uh, when one organism lives in another organism and harms it. Competition and mutualism, all of those are examples of biotic interactions. Alternatively, the interrelationships may take a more diffuse route, such as organisms that create necessary climatic conditions, or one that acts as a substrate for another organism. For instance, a tree might provide shade, which enables certain other organisms to live. And if you remove the shade, the organism wouldn't live. Because the tree has changed the climatic conditions, or we should say microclimate. But I suppose we could go further. Trees bring rain, so it makes the area more damp. Um, or trees also, since they grow into the air, other plants can live on the tree, a thing called an epiphyte. So you have all kinds of relationships between organisms. Then, if you look at communities, there are two main types. You have a major community, which is the smallest ecological unit, which is able to sustain itself and is self-regulating. So a pond, for example, can be a major community. These communities are relatively independent of other communities. For example, a pond, a forest, a grassland, or a lake. Long-lasting and mature major ecosystems contain only those organisms which are successfully adapted to the environment and to other species within the community. A major community is an assemblage of faunal communities, or zoonosis, or a floral community, which is a phytocynosis, or a microbial community, or microbiocenosis. Minor communities are merocenoses, which make up major communities, are small ecological units that are not self-sustaining and rely on interactions with other communities. So an example of a minor community is a collection of organisms which live within a piece of dead wood on the forest floor. So Uh, a piece of deadwood on the forest floor can host a minor community, but the point is it's dependent on the forest itself for its own uh, existence. So it's not self-sustaining. I suppose at one point, for example, the deadwood on the forest floor will eventually decompose, and the members of that community will therefore need to find another piece of deadwood in order to continue their existence. Then an ecosystem or biome describes a single environment where every living biotic organism and non-living factor is contained and characterizes it. In fact, there is a difference between an ecosystem and a biome. So a biome really is a ecological area. And when we talk about the abiotic factors, we're really thinking of an ecosystem. We'll come to that in a minute. So the contents of an ecosystem can range from light and moisture levels to a plant and animal life. And the process of a biome range from birth and reproduction to death and decomposition. I'll deal with that in a minute. In an ecosystem, living organisms are grouped into producers, consumers, and decomposers. So a former representing all plant life, consumers, and organisms that eat them and each other, and the latter those of scavengers and bacteria, which break down dead organic matter. Um, so scavengers and bacteria are decomposers. So we tend to think of decomposers as bacteria. But for example, the John Crow is also a decomposer because it's a scavenger, it will eat dead organic matter. So together, these living components are known as biotic factors. And abiotic factors are the non-living components, and they can be climatic, social, or edaphic. And edaphic really referring to influenced by the soil and ground type. And the calorific flow of energy flow that travels through an ecosystem food chain is initially provided through the input of the ecosystem itself. For example, the amount of sunlight available for plant life. So the energy really that goes through an ecosystem must start with a producer in order to get the energy to sustain the ecosystem. Um, so all ecosystems depend on the producer, and the producer needs to get its energy from somewhere, which is normally sunlight. And without abiotic factors, no ecosystem can provide for biotic factors. So you need abiotic factors there. And ecosystems are constantly changing. Human threats to biodiversity include deforestation, pollution, transmission of disease through natural borders, introduction of non-indigenous species, and reduced natural habitats through overpopulation. The point is ecosystems are constantly changing, and this occurs with or without input from man. But man is causing ecosystems to change much more rapidly. And more natural threats include the migration of species in a particular region, a change in season, or a fatal disease which only affects one species. Most diseases, in fact, tend to be fairly specific. Uh, then ecosystem examples. Ecosystems are limitless. So the point there is an ecosystem does not have to cover a large region. They exist in a small pond inside human homes and even the human gut. So the human gut can be a ecosystem. Alternatively, ecosystems can cover huge areas of the planet. So there's a wide range to the different types of ecosystem that are present. One of the smallest ecosystems, that is in terms of area and not in terms of population, is the human gut. In fact, the human gut contains millions and millions of uh, microbes. So in terms of population, it's very large. This ecosystem does not receive any energy from the sunlight, yet it supports millions of living organisms. But the energy, of course, comes from the person eating food. Um, these are supplied with a food source in a moist, dark, and warm environment, so the perfect conditions for microorganisms. So our gut basically being warm, dark, and moist provides perfect conditions for microorganisms to live, and therefore they will go there. And our bodies contain thousands of ecosystems, all of them supporting huge colonies of healthy but also pathogenic single-celled organisms. So the organisms themselves might be healthy, although they might make us uh, unhealthy because they can be pathogenic, meaning they cause disease. A small shaded pond in a temperate region represents an aquatic ecosystem. Waterlogged soils and excess shade affect plant life biodiversity, where only species suited to the environment will proliferate, and the availability of producers affects which organisms thrive in and around the pond. Primary consumers, which are herbivores, must provide enough energy for secondary consumers and so on. Should pesticides be added to the pond, or the water freeze over and become choked with thick layers of weed, the ecosystem of this pond must adjust. And ecosystems are adjusting all the time due to changes in the surrounding uh, surroundings. On a much smaller scale, but an artificial one, the Eden biome is a smaller representation of a global ecosystem, contains multiple ecosystems for research purposes. You're going to look at the Eden biome by yourselves, because it's a video which is attached to this uh, presentation, where separate domes have varying climates and light levels and support different producers, consumers, and decomposers. And in an artificial biome, variables are tightly controlled, and one does not have usually heard of elephants in a biome. Um, the Eden project doesn't have that kind of thing. This is the Eden project. You have these large number of dome-shaped spheres, and you have different habitats in each of the domes, ranging from dry desert conditions to tropical rainforests. That's the YouTube presentation. It's worthwhile watching it. And this looks at the difference between a biome and an ecosystem. So the point is a biome is a large land area with distinct climate and plants and animals. Uh, so tropical rainforests, for example, are an example of a biome. A desert is another example of a biome. Because an ecosystem is an interaction of biotic and abiotic components. And so the point is you can think of it, say the Amazon is an example of a biome. And in the Amazon you contain a large number of different ecosystems. As I said, we have ecosystems even within our guts, but those aren't biomes, but they're still ecosystems. So in a biome, the geographical area is large. For an ecosystem, the geographical area is usually small. But a biome, it depends on climatic factors such as rainfall, ice, snow, temperature, etc. So, for example, you only find rainforests in the tropics, and you find alpine forests in close to Arctic regions. But an ecosystem, for example, the bacteria in our gut, doesn't really depend on climatic factors. And you can have a pond ecosystem in different areas. So a biome comprises multiple ecosystems. An ecosystem is part of a biome. Biomes abound in plants and animal species, whereas an ecosystem is smaller in size. In a biome, all the organisms in a biome do not interact with each other. Clearly, in a tropical rainforest, since it's very large, some organisms don't have the chance to interact with each other. But kind of with an ecosystem, by definition, more or less, the organisms interact with each other. Biomes are affected by latitude. They change, but ecosystems don't. A biome is as it says, desert, grasslands, tundra, tropical rainforests are biomes. An ecosystem with things such as a pond or a coral reef or so on. So then after that, we have the biosphere. And it comes from the Greek bios meaning life and sphere. So the biosphere is a part of the earth where we find living organisms. And it's a layer of the planet Earth where life exists. And the layer ranges from high up to 10 kilometers above sea level, used by some birds in flight, to depth of the ocean, such as the Puerto Rico Trench, and more than 8 kilometers deep. So notice some birds in fact fly up to 10 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. These extremes, however, in general, the layer of the Earth's surface is thin. The upper atmosphere has little oxygen and very low temperatures. That's why it's very surprising that you can find birds flying up to 10 kilometers above sea level. Because at that height, the temperature is very low and the level of oxygen is very little. While the ocean depths greater than 1,000 meters are dark and cold, and also the pressure is very high. So if you went down to such a depth, you'd not be able to breathe in because the pressure on your chest would be so high that your chest would not be able to expand. And therefore, even if you had an aqua lung on, you wouldn't be able to breathe. In fact, it has been said the biosphere is like the peel in relation to the size of an apple. If you know an American apple, the peel is very thin. And that's basically like the biosphere in comparison to the Earth. And the biosphere is unique. So far, there has been no existence of life elsewhere in the universe. We're searching for it, and there probably is life elsewhere, but so far we've not found it. So life on Earth depends on the sun, and the energy produced by sunlight is captured by plants and some bacteria and protists in the marvelous phenomenon of photosynthesis. Those of you who do biology will learn all about photosynthesis in Unit 2. The captured energy transforms carbon dioxide into organic compounds such as sugars and produces oxygen. And the vast majority of species of animal, fungi, parasitic plants, and many bacteria depend directly on photosynthesis. You probably know there's some bacteria found in the ocean vents which can obtain energy from chemosynthesis, which don't need light energy, but nearly all organisms do. In the late 1970s, ecosystems were discovered which are relatively independent of the sun. From fishes in the deepest ocean, waters of extremely high temperature, and that's over 400 degrees Celsius. The point here, of course, is that in the deepest parts of the ocean, pressure is really high, and therefore temperatures can reach up to 400 degrees C without the water boiling. It's a bit like a pressure cooker, where the water gets to a much higher temperature because of the pressure inside of the uh, pressure cooker. So extremely high temperatures vents out heat by magma beneath the Earth's surface, and on contact with the cold water, dissolved minerals precipitate, forming chimneys that can reach great heights. In the vicinity of hydrothermal vents exists dense animal community that is dependent on chemosynthetic bacteria. And of course, the name is self-explanatory. Chemosynthesis is obtaining energy from chemicals rather than light. And the bacteria use and convert sulfur compounds driven out by the hot water and are preyed on by a variety of animals, including small crustaceans. And the type of crustaceans are things called amphipods or copepods. You can do research on those because we don't have time to continue, which in turn prey for snails, crabs, shrimp, worms, giant tube worms, fish, and octopus. Um, After the biosphere, we have the atmosphere. And the atmosphere has these different layers to it: the exosphere, the thermosphere, the mesosphere, the stratosphere, and the troposphere. Um, in the troposphere, temperature decreases as we increase in height. In the stratosphere, temperature increases again. In the mesosphere, it goes down again. And then in the thermosphere, temperature increases. And that's the rationale behind separating the layers of the Earth's surface. Then you have the hydrosphere, which is where you find water on the Earth. It's mainly the sea, but it's also ponds and lakes and rivers, and even the clouds can be considered part of the hydrosphere. And sometimes you can even find algae and things in the clouds, although it will be very low. And then we have the lithosphere, which are the rocks. After that, habitat is where an organism lives. So a habitat is a zone in which an organism lives and where it can find food, shelter, protection. So a polar bear, its habitat is the ice on the polar regions. So sea ice is vital for polar bears. It's a habitat. The tropical rainforest in Indonesia is where the orangutan lives. There's tropical rainforest in Sumatra. You can think of a flea. Its habitat is the fur of a dog. After that, we have an ecological niche, which is a role which or that an organism has in an ecosystem. It describes its functional position of an organism in its environment. So it can include its habitat, its adaptations, activity present, patterns, presence of other organisms, physical conditions. So a niche comprises its habitat, the organism's activity, and the resources it obtains from the habitat, and also the resources that it contributes to the habitat as well. All of that forms its niche. So in ecology, a niche is a role or job of a species in a habitat, and it comes from the word niche, which means to nest. An ecological niche describes how a species interacts with and lives in its habitat. Ecological niches have specific characteristics such as availability of nutrients, temperature, terrain, sunlight, and predators which dictate how and how well a species survives and reproduces. And the species carves out a niche for itself in the habitat, being able to adapt to and diverge from other species. And modern day ecologists study ecological niches in terms of the impact of the species has on its environment as well as its requirements. And according to competitive exclusion principle, two species cannot occupy the same niche in the habitat if they are competing for the same resources. When species compete in a niche, natural selection will remove the lesser in the dependence of the species on a shared resource. If they compete directly, one species will either be eliminated or forced to occupy a different niche. If one species is successful, it reduces the competition. If neither evolves to reduce competition, then the species that can be more efficient exploit the resource and win out. And the other species will become extinct. After that, we have what is called an ecotone. An ecotone is a region between one ecosystem and another. They can vary in size from being very narrow to quite wide, and they are very rich in biodiversity, containing species from each of the overlapping ecosystems to give their own unique species. So you have a forest and a grassland. You have a region between the two, which is called an ecotone. Notice as these forests dies out, the number of forest species decreases and the number of grassland species increases. But in the ecotone, you have a combination of both of them. And often the number of species and population density is greater in ecotones. That's important. Ecotones often have a very high species diversity. And ecotones are sensitive to environmental changes, e.g., climate change and human activities. So ecotones are, in a sense, more threatened by climate change than the other two. An ecotone has a characteristic of two bordering ecosystems, and as a result, it has a very high density of organisms, and variety of species can be found in an ecotone. They act as a bridge flow from one community to another and provide a habitat for a large number of species. In fact, some species are only found in the ecotone, but it also allows for gene flow. And even if you have two two different forests separated by grassland, uh, the ecotone can allow movement between the two forests. And due to these characteristics, ecotones have a very rich and vibrant biodiversity. Therefore, ecotones are of great environmental importance. And an ecotone can act as a buffer zone. You can think of a mangrove forest and say this in this, protecting neighbouring ecosystems from possible environmental damage. For example, mangrove forests provide a natural buffer against tsunamis and, for that matter, hurricane damage when, because hurricanes cause a rising of waves and so on as well. For example, mangrove forests provide a natural buffer against tsunamis, and the wetland can absorb pollutants to prevent them from entering the estuary. And ecotones are very ecologically sensitive areas. They are natural indicators of climate change and its consequences, and they are a matter of great scientific interest. So you can think of a grassland or forest, and why it confers is called an ecotone. And that basically finishes this presentation. So at this point, we're going to stop.